If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello, and welcome to the third part of our column called Speculative Whiteness. My name is Alan Bailey, and I'll be your co-host for this column. In this column, I'm discussing racism in the alt-right with Hugo Award-winning Dr. Jordan Carroll. In the third episode, we break down a number of important concepts needed to understand the alt-right and how they view speculative fiction. Concepts include low time preference, metapolitics, Archeofuturism, Faustianism, and mutant romances, among other things. Dr. Jordan S. Carroll is the author of Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right, published by University of Minnesota Press, 2024, and Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors in the Class Politics of U.S. Literature, published by Stanford University Press, 2021. His latest book is a Hugo Award winner for Best Related Work, and his first book won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars. He was also the recipient of the David G. Hartwell Emerging Scholar Award by the International Association for the Fantastic and the Arts. Carroll's writing has appeared in Kaleidotrope, American Literature, Post 45, Polygon, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and The Nation. You can find a link to his publisher's site in the notes. So this section is called Motherfucking Nazi Info Dump. To all the listeners, I'm just going to warn you now, there's going to be a lot of info dump here, obviously. A lot of big terms are going to be explained here that appear in Jordan's book, a lot of stuff that I have never heard about before, but kind of gives perspective to some of the history of speculative fiction in general. So I think we're just going to go through and have you explain a bunch of concepts here. So let's start with low time preferences. We kind of hit on this a bit in an earlier section where you mentioned that some of the alt-right believe that only white men are capable of, thinking about the future and planning for the future and that sort of a thing. So can you explain exactly what low time preferences are and why it matters?
I think that the easiest way to understand it is the classic marshmallow test. Do you want one marshmallow now or two marshmallows in the future? And it's this idea that the lower your time preference is, the longer you're willing to wait for that second marshmallow. And so a lot of paleo-libertarians, as well as a lot of people on the alt-right, have argued that white men, and particularly elite white men, are capable of delaying gratification longer, investing in the future, not eating the marshmallow now, but waiting a little bit, or even waiting for a long time in order to receive a greater return. And this is an old idea that's been expressed in a lot of different ways. Whenever the colonizers were casting around for ways to justify their violence and domination, they would suggest that indigenous people, for example, were present oriented, whereas white colonizers are future oriented, and we see this as well in conversations around a supposed Black culture of poverty. It's really a perennial idea, one that should obviously be stamped out as quickly as possible, that certain groups of people only live for the now, and dominant groups of people are building cathedrals or spaceships or whatever project in the future.
That's interesting. And I'm sitting here thinking about, the juxtaposition between that idea and then what we were talking about way back at the beginning of this series with how people, readers and programmers experience time differently, right? And like, how does that work together? But I just feel like there's a lot of this is one of those areas where there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. And I mean, I've known a lot of people who grew up poor, you know. A lot of my friends are black. You know, my boss right now is black. You know what I mean? Like it's to me, it's just wild. It's wild. Completely not my lived experience at all.
Yeah, it goes to show the ways that people cast around to try to explain why either they have more stuff or why they deserve more stuff. I think that it's a theory that's designed to suggest that the people in power, the people with wealth, or in some cases the people who should have power and wealth are that way because they're morally superior, and that moral superiority in their mind is rooted in their biology or their racial spirit or whatever imaginary thing they're trying to use to suggest that it's part of their fundamental identity that can't be changed.
It's just wild. The one person I know who can most put off self gratification grew up very poor. You know, this person rarely buys anything for themselves. You know what I mean? Is always more concerned about other people. You know, even just that one example, is just against everything. So
Yeah.
just so strange to me. You have this other concept in here called Faustianism. Can you talk about that a little bit? And how does that tie into, the literary Faust?
This comes out of the German conservative thinker Oswald Spengler, and it's been adopted and adapted by fascists and people on the alt right. It's an idea that Faustianism is the idea that white men are inherently exploratory. They take risks. They go out into the world. They try new things. They're willing to bet everything on a dream, and sometimes that might result in the catastrophic failure, but other times that results in great achievements in whether science and technology or in exploring the world. And here we should hear that settler colonial resonance. It's this idea that white men conquered uh, large territories and eliminated or dominated the original inhabitants of those territories, not because they wanted to extract more resources or because they wanted to acquire more labor, but because there is some inherent drive in white men to transcend the here and now and change the world. And the way it connects with Faust is that in Goethe's version of Faust, he, especially in the second half of the poem, is driving to change the world, to expand. To, I think at one point he's even like pushing back the ocean in order to create more land. But he's always going beyond the current rules and restrictions of the present in order to achieve something great. And as with all these ideas, we need to be really skeptical of this. There are no cultures out there that have not contended with difficult circumstances and strive to overcome them. There's no culture that doesn't have a long history of innovation, and obviously we should be skeptical of the kind of pure motives that the fascists attribute to white colonizers as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You saying all this reminds me a lot of Elon Musk right now, actually. In your opinion, does this explain his, obsession with exploring Mars and his his move to buy Twitter and this Doge thing that's going on and so forth?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that it might help explain Trump's statements about space exploration. He directly described going to Mars as manifest destiny. So he directly thinks of going to Mars as a
Hmm.
settler colonial project of expansion into new territories. Musk is a complicated figure because I think that he is not as interested in the capital R romantic side of the far right.
Hmm.
He's not interested in a kind of depth of emotion and a vision of a harmonious organic community or the mythic elements that the far right often tries to press gang into their vision of the world. He sees himself more as a rationalist, and I think that for Musk, space exploration is based on a calculation that expansion onto other planets will maximize the population of genetically gifted people.
Hmm.
And it's very much about trying to look into the long-term future and create the conditions for more elite births, essentially.
I really find it fascinating too, the connection between, I guess this is loosely related, at least in my mind, talking about Musk and Trump, and it makes me also think of Bezos and all of our other corporate overlords that we have right now, right? I find that the connection between the alt-right and capitalism is pretty fascinating because in a lot of ways they support each other. For example, we need to have, well, we don't need to have, but they think that we need to have a working class, right? And so a lot of times blacks or, you know, Latino folks or somebody, are kind of pushed down and kept down at that lower level, right? But then conversely, it can also be the opposite sometimes. We do see people who benefit, from a really great idea who rise up to the top and are able to move forward. Now, of course, it's rare and it's hard and there's a lot of pressure on those people, but they can end up benefiting from those things at times. What thoughts do you have on the relationship between capitalism and the alt-right?
I think ideologically, some of them are very much in support of an unfettered free market capitalism, and others are interested in a welfare state for the master race. So there is one wing that comes out of libertarianism that believes the biggest hurdle to capitalist expansion is the state, in particular the welfare state, as well as state policies that promote racial liberalism and a more inclusive and diverse nation. And so they want to break up the state into smaller entities that would be governed by CEOs and would be almost neo Confederate insofar as these smaller entities could segregate or remove populations that they considered to be undesirable. So that's one vision that if we got rid of all of diversity, if we got rid of civil rights, and if we got rid of the redistributive state, it would allow for a more unfettered competition between these ethnically homogenous and very market oriented smaller states ruled not by democracy, but by some kind of unchecked CEO corporate power. But there's another wing, I think, that is more critical, not so much of capitalism itself, but of the symptoms that arise due to capitalism. So there's a long-standing tradition that we could point out how its lineage goes all the way back to the Nazis that sees productive capital, industrial capital, say, as good, but is worried about the influence of finance capital that hates the banks and drawing on a tradition of anti Semitic conspiracy theories, sees these banks as controlled by Jews. They're also worried about the emasculating, in their mind, influence of consumerism and certain kinds of service sector labor. And they want to return to a world of factories and peasants and, a world where people did manual labor as opposed to the kinds of desk jobs that we now see.
Hmm.
And so that is not really a critique, because that would be suggesting that they have something insightful to say, but I guess I should say a series of grievances that they have about capitalism that try to blame our current malaise and our current crisis-ridden moment not on something fundamental about capitalism, but on these different phenomena that arise as a result of capitalism. So they're fine with inequality. They're fine with the bosses being in power,
Hmm.
but they just want to make it a system where people really build things and real work is getting done. So it's trying to displace the current ills not only onto these superficial phenomena, but also displace them onto a group.
Hmm.
That capitalism was fine until whether it be Jews or immigrants or some other group came along and perverted it and distorted it from a more supposedly healthy and productive system. And that's in some ways always the move of the right. The present system would be fine were it not for some exterior enemy that is coming in and wrecking things.
Hmm. Hmm. I feel like there's a lot of people who believe in the deep state in this group. There's a lot of these folks who want to like live off the grid and refuse to sign contracts and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's like this idea that things are wrong because some nefarious actor has decided that they're wrong, and it would just revert to an organic, wholesome community if that particular cabal or conspiracy or whatever, however it is they imagine it, if that were just removed, everything would be fine.
Right, right. Wow. All right. Okay, let's move on to some more of these other concepts you got here because you've got a lot going on in this book, right? The next one I have in here is I don't even okay, I may not pronounce this correctly. Archeofuturism? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. What is archeofuturism and why is it important to this overall discussion about speculative whiteness?
This is an idea that comes out of the French New Right that suggests that the ideal social order would combine, on one hand, high technology, and on the other hand, traditional folk ways. And so they suggest that in some ways these are two things are interrelated, that technology and other forms of progressive change are rooted in some kind of European spirit or essence, and that in order to continue developing new technologies and exploring space and these other kinds of quote unquote Faustian moves, they believe that the European identity must be preserved. If Europeans are the fountain of all innovation, then that kind of culture and racial makeup must be kept segregated and kept pure
Ah,
ultimately.
interesting. Interesting. What are metapolitics?
This is the idea that political change emerges, at least in part, out of cultural change. And in particular, the alt right wants to use cultural subversion as a way of changing white people's fundamental assumptions about how the world works. And so the alt right believes, or at least some of them believe, that they can persuade people by writing criticism or producing literature and culture of their own that will normalize fascism and normalize white nationalism.
And is this where we see some of these science fiction writers come in? Like, let's say, like Vox Day, for example, who, you know, he's coming in and he's trying to create this culture, right?
Yeah, I don't know if he explicitly is drawing on this idea of metapolitics, but it's definitely the same kind of playbook. I think that they do want to use culture as a way of pushing their ideas in a more covert fashion. Which is not to say that this doesn't happen.
Hmm.
That it is in fact true that some of our politics are shaped by the cultural lens through which we see the world. But I think one thing that we should take objection to here is the idea that culture is made by these exceptional individuals that then impose it on the masses. Like they want
Hmm.
not a kind of ground up cultural change, not a really countercultural view of how this change would happen, but instead they want to be the orchestrators of a cultural revolution that is top down, and a few brilliant minds will then propagate the ideas that the rest of us will mechanically take up and follow.
Yeah. Yeah. The last topic I've got for this section of the interview is mutational romances. I had never really thought about these as a thing before, but as soon as I read the concept, I was like, oh, yeah. Oh, they're here and there and there and there and there and there. And now I see them everywhere. You know what I mean? So, can you explain what a mutational romance is and why they matter and maybe give an example or two?
Sure, it's, as you point out, a really ubiquitous subgenre, I guess we could call it. Narratives that are all about the figure of the mutant who, maybe they have psychic powers or some other ability that nobody else has, who is on one hand an outsider often, and on the other hand, in some ways better than everybody else. And often this has been a way of fans talking about fandom. Fans or slans was a slogan for a while,
Oh, yeah.
referring to the A.E. von Vogt novel about the oppressed mutants. I think this genre has a really complicated politics because you get some narratives that are clearly allegories for racial and other forms of oppression. The famous example probably being X-Men. But on the other hand, we often see in the mutational romance this idea of the marginalized outsider who is superior and ultimately who should dominate over everyone else. The slan who can think deep into the future and who is so much smarter and so much more self-disciplined than baseline humans, and who is working towards ultimately global domination. And I think that what we see then is in some mutational romances, there's a strain of elitism that sees a small group of people as worthy of rule, and that sees the masses as, if not worthy of being ruled, then in some cases worthy of being eliminated entirely, because they imagine most people as throwbacks to some prior evolutionary stage that is about to be superseded by the next form of human being or next species of human being.
First of all, let me say thanks for going through and explaining all of that because there is just so much going on there. And I think it's important, even if none of our listeners remember the names of these things, that they're aware of these concepts and that these concepts are being used to push racist or fascist ideas, right? I know a lot of our listeners are writers, so I would ask our writer listeners to think about their writing in conjunction with these concepts, and the readers out there too, if you're reading something, think back to these concepts and do these concepts apply to what you're reading? If they do, I would encourage you to think about the intent of the author. I know some authors say they have no intent other than to entertain, but some do. Even if they don't, that might be something to think about. Even if they state they don't have an intent, and this is still coming up. Anyway, so I guess I think this section in particular is a very important section for our listeners. People who are critical thinkers, people who are writers, and people who care about the publishing industry and science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Yeah, so thanks for summing those up and being able to diving in and finding these and naming them for us.
It's definitely a miserable topic to think about, and to have to to sort of immerse oneself in this it's distressing, but I do feel like we do want to know our enemy, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I've got questions about that later.
Yeah.
All right, and that's all for this episode. Don't forget to rate and review us if you like what we're doing. In the next episode of this series, I'm calling Whitey in Space. We do some analysis of what these concepts look like. We also begin our discussion of how to push back on fascist and racist ideas and speculative fiction. Keep an eye out for that episode coming soon.